The morning of March 3, 1943, arrived with deceptive calm over Port Moresby. Dawn light crept across New Guinea in soft bands of gold and pink. Major Edward Larnes felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as he climbed into the cockpit of his B-25 Mitchell. His hands found the control column with practiced ease. The metal was cool under his palms. Through the scarred plexiglass canopy, salt air mixed with aviation fuel created that distinctive smell of morning missions. He could taste it on his lips. Twin Wright Cyclone engines thundered to life around him. The sound reverberated through his chest cavity. 11 more B-25s sat on the tarmac behind him. Their propellers carved invisible arcs through the humid tropical air. Each blade caught morning light and threw it back in silver flashes. What the Japanese convoy steaming toward them across the Bismarck Sea could never imagine was simple. In 15 minutes, everything they understood about naval warfare would crumble. A bombing technique so radical, so apparently suicidal, that military experts had dismissed it as impossible. The mathematics of destruction were about to change forever. No longer would bombs fall from safe altitudes in graceful arcs. Instead, they would skip across wave tops like stones hurled by angry gods. The altitude for this attack was 200 feet. Nothing more, nothing less. At that height, traveling between 200 and 250 miles per hour, bomber crews could smell the ocean spray. They could see individual faces on enemy ships before their weapons struck home. Close enough to count rivets on destroyer hulls. Close enough to feel the heat from exploding targets. The Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul with complete confidence. 8 destroyers provided escort. Dozens of Zero fighters patrolled overhead. Their captains believed themselves invulnerable. Traditional naval wisdom supported their confidence. High-altitude bombing had proven spectacularly ineffective against maneuvering ships. But the rules were about to change forever. 2 months earlier, the transformation had begun in modest headquarters buildings at Port Moresby. Lieutenant General George Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force. Throughout 1942, his bombers had achieved almost nothing against Japanese shipping. Flying at altitudes between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, bombardiers watched their weapons create impressive waterspouts. But precious few enemy vessels went to the bottom. The statistics told a devastating story. In January 1943, American aircraft had flown 416 sorties against a single Japanese convoy. Results were pathetic. 2 ships sunk, 3 others damaged. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued resupplying their garrisons with near impunity. The tide of the Pacific War hung in the balance. Kenney was a problem solver by nature. His experience as a fighter pilot in the First World War had taught him that conventional thinking often led to conventional failure. He understood the fundamental problem with high-altitude bombing. Ships could maneuver. Bombs dropped from 10,000 feet took nearly a minute to reach their targets. That gave enemy captains plenty of time to turn their vessels. They could present smaller profiles. They could steer between falling weapons. The solution seemed obvious. Attack from altitude so low that ships had no time to react. But flying within a few hundred feet of heavily armed warships violated every principle of bomber survival. Anti-aircraft guns would have clear fields of fire at that range. A single direct hit would vaporize an aircraft instantly. The risks appeared overwhelming. Then Kenney heard about a technique that might change everything. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully employed skip bombing at Rabaul. The date was October 22nd to 23rd, 1942. Attacking at night, Benn had sunk enemy ships by releasing bombs that bounced across the water, like flat stones on a pond. The concept was elegantly simple. Bombers approaching at extremely low altitude would release their weapons at high speed. Delayed fuses would prevent immediate detonation. The bombs would skip across the water surface. They would bounce into or under target vessels before exploding. Ben had proven the tactic worked in actual combat. But he died on January 18, 1943. His B-17 disappeared over New Guinea before he could perfect the technique for large-scale daylight operations. No one had yet attempted coordinated attacks by entire squadrons. No one had perfected the aircraft modifications needed to make medium bombers survivable at masthead height. No one had trained complete units in the split-second timing required to skip bombs successfully, while under intense enemy fire. Until now. The architect of the modified B-25 was Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose wife and children had been trapped in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. Gunn's personal rage against the enemy combined with his mechanical genius. The result was what became known as the Commerce Destroyer. Working in primitive maintenance facilities at Port Moresby, Gunn and his team stripped the bombardier position from B-25 Mitchell bomber noses. They replaced it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. More weapons were added along the fuselage. Eventually, 8 to 12 heavy machine guns fired forward simultaneously. The result was a flying battleship. It could pour devastating firepower into targets while approaching for bomb runs. The guns served multiple purposes. First, they suppressed anti-aircraft fire by sweeping enemy decks clear of gunners. Heavy slugs from 50-caliber weapons could penetrate destroyer hulls. They knocked out gun positions. They created chaos aboard target vessels. Second, the nose guns allowed pilots to aim their entire aircraft like giant weapons. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where bombardiers calculated complex trajectories, the low-altitude technique required pilots to fly directly at targets. They used simple reference marks on windscreens as gun sights. When the marker aligned with the target ship, co-pilots or bombardiers released bombs. The approach was brutally direct. It demanded nerves of steel. But the modified aircraft were only half the equation. The other half was training pilots to fly them at suicidal altitudes with precision timing. That responsibility fell to Edward Larness. He took command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron in late December 1942. Larness was a barrel-chested pilot with a reputation for aggressive flying and absolute fearlessness. He wore a beat-up service cap pushed back on his head. His men knew him for being willing to lead any mission he ordered them to fly. When Kenny explained the concept and showed him the modified B-25s, Larness's response was characteristic. He would train his men. They would not miss. Training began in January 1943 on the SS Pruth. A British steamer had been wrecked on Nathra Reef since December 31, 1923. For weeks, B-25 crews practiced diving to 200 feet. They released practice bombs toward the rusting hulk in Port Moresby Harbor. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 bombs. They learned to use windscreen reference marks instead of bomb sights. When one crew struck the wreck's mast and crashed, killing all aboard, the squadron attended the funeral. They resumed practicing the next day. Larness drove his men relentlessly. He understood what was at stake. The Japanese were consolidating their hold on New Guinea. They were building airfields that could threaten Australia itself. American and Australian ground forces were locked in brutal jungle warfare against an enemy that refused to surrender. Every Japanese convoy that reached New Guinea meant more troops, more ammunition, more supplies that would cost Allied lives to overcome. The only way to stop the convoys was to sink them at sea. By late February 1943, the 90th Squadron was ready. Larness reported to Kenny that his boys were a cocky gang who would not miss their targets. Within days, they had their chance to prove it. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943. Intelligence decrypts from Allied codebreakers had revealed the convoy's destination and approximate arrival time. Lae, New Guinea. 8 transport ships carried 6,900 troops desperately needed to reinforce Japanese positions. Protecting them were 8 destroyers. Formidable warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and veteran crews. Japanese planners believed the convoy would be safe. They had routed it along the northern coast of New Britain to take advantage of storm fronts that would provide cloud cover. They had assigned experienced captains who understood convoy defense. They had scheduled the journey to minimize exposure to Allied air attacks. Everything had been calculated to ensure success. But the Allies were watching. Reconnaissance flights tracked the convoy from the moment it left Rabaul. On the afternoon of March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the ships through a break in the clouds around 3 o'clock. The crew radioed coordinates and the convoy's course. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, the information triggered a carefully prepared plan. Kenny assembled his forces. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would strike first from medium altitude. Their job was to scatter the convoy and force ships into evasive maneuvers. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, A-20 Havocs of the 89th Attack Squadron. Australian Beaufighters armed with cannons and machine guns, all attacking at masthead height in coordinated waves that would overwhelm the convoy's defenses. The Japanese faced the full fury of low-altitude warfare for the first time on this scale. March the 2nd began with frustration. Weather obscured the convoy through most of the day. B-17s sent to attack found only clouds and empty ocean. But by evening, the weather began to clear. On the morning of March 3rd, reconnaissance crews relocated the convoy. It was steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The ships were about 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen. Exactly where Allied planners had predicted they would be. Kenny gave the order. All units would attack. The battle was about to begin. Larness gathered his squadron commanders for final instructions. The plan called for different aircraft to attack from different altitudes simultaneously. This would create confusion and divide the convoy's defensive fire. B-17s would bomb from 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Beaufighters would strafe at wave-top level. The B-25s would come in behind the Beaufighters at 200 feet. They would use their forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire while delivering their bombs. Larness's orders to his pilots were direct. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your guns to clear the decks. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out fast. The formation would attack in elements of 3 or 4 aircraft. Wingmen would provide covering fire while lead planes concentrated on bombing. They would approach targets from the beam, parallel to the ship's length. This maximized the target profile and gave the bombs the best angle for skipping into hulls. Timing was critical. Release the bombs too early, and they would bounce over the target. Too late, and the aircraft would be directly over the ship when the delayed fuses detonated. This would destroy bomber and crew together. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. At 8:55 in the morning, the call came. The convoy had been positively identified and was within range. Larness shouted to his squadron, "Cape Ward Hunt, 0930, let's go." Engines roared to life. Modified B-25s began taxiing toward the runway at Port Moresby. Behind them, A-20 crews of the 89th prepared to follow. The plan called for all attacking aircraft to rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and strike at 10. As Larness's B-25 lifted off, he could see the coastline of New Guinea falling away behind him. Ahead lay open ocean and a Japanese convoy that had no idea what was coming. The flight to the target took less than an hour. At 10,000 feet, formation flying was smooth and visibility was perfect. Larness could see the other elements of the strike force assembling. Heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group climbed to altitude. P-38 Lightning fighters took up positions as top cover. They were ready to engage any Japanese fighters that might interfere. Australian Beaufighters, twin-engine aircraft armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, dropped to wave-top altitude. Everything was coming together with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17s spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese ships were visible on the water below. Their wakes drew white lines across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed in formation. They were surrounded by 8 destroyers that maneuvered to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was a formidable force. The Japanese captains believed they were ready for any attack. At 10 o'clock precisely, the first B-17s began their bomb runs. Flying at 7,000 feet, they released 1,000-pound bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and intense. Destroyers and transports opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of fire. One transport took a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another was struck and caught fire. But most of the high-altitude bombs missed. They created massive columns of water that drenched the ships but did no damage. The Japanese captains breathed easier. This was conventional bombing. This they could handle. Then the Beaufighters arrived. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters came in at masthead height. They skimmed the waves at over 300 miles per hour. Japanese gunners trained to track high-altitude bombers suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally across their field of fire. Before they could adjust, the Beaufighters opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through destroyer superstructures. Machine gun bullets swept the decks of transport ships. The heavy cannons could penetrate armored positions. Japanese sailors and soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as the Australian aircraft roared past. Chaos followed in their wake. The Beaufighter attack lasted only minutes, but it achieved its purpose. The convoy's defensive formation began to break apart. Destroyers, mistaking the low-flying Beaufighters for torpedo bombers, turned bow on to present smaller targets. This maneuver, standard doctrine against torpedo attacks, left the transport ships more exposed. Into this chaos came Larness and his B-25s. Larness's squadron approached from the southeast at 2,000 feet. This gave the pilots time to select targets and plan their attack runs. Through his windscreen, he could see the convoy spread out below. Ships were maneuvering wildly. Smoke was rising from vessels already hit by the B-17s. He selected his target, a large destroyer. He pushed his control column forward. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean in a controlled dive. At 200 feet, Larness leveled out and pushed his throttles to full power. The bomber accelerated to 225 miles per hour. The ocean surface raced past just below his wheels. His 3 wingmen followed, spacing themselves to engage different targets. Larness armed his forward guns. At 1,200 yards, Larness opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns in the nose of his B-25 erupted. Streams of half-inch bullets streaked toward the destroyer. The effect was devastating. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down instantly. Gun positions exploded in showers of sparks as armor-piercing rounds penetrated steel. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Chaos erupted aboard the enemy vessel. Gunners tried to return fire while being shredded by American machine guns. Larnes held his course rock steady. The reference mark on his windscreen aligned perfectly with the destroyer's waterline. At 300 yards, his co-pilot called out ranges. 200 yards, 100 yards. At the precise moment, Larnes's bombardier released two 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs dropped away and immediately struck the water. The delayed fuses prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, the bombs skipped. They bounced off the ocean surface like stones. They were carried forward by their momentum. The first bomb struck the water, bounced once, and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The second bomb followed. It hit the water and skipped directly under the vessel. Larnes pulled back on his control column. The B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. His gunners in the waist positions fired continuously. They raked the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. 5 seconds after the bombs hit, while Larnes's B-25 was a quarter-mile away, the delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the destroyer. The first bomb blew a massive hole in the hull at the waterline. The second bomb, exploding underneath the keel, broke the destroyer's back. The vessel began settling immediately. Its watertight compartments flooded faster than damage control crews could respond. Behind Larnes, his wingmen were executing their own attacks. Lieutenant Charles Howell went after a transport ship. His nose guns cleared the deck of personnel before his bombs skipped into the vessel's side. Captain John Hennebrey, leading the second element, fired continuously as he approached another transport. His tracers walked across the ship's superstructure. One of Hennebrey's bombs scored a direct hit amidships. The transport shuddered from the explosion. Fire erupted from its cargo holds. Lieutenant John Small attacked a different transport. He put 2 bombs into its hull and dropped 2 more on another vessel's bow. All around the convoy, B-25s were executing perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested in isolated night raids at Rabaul was now working flawlessly on a massive scale. The Japanese response was hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the attack. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were on top of them before they could aim. The 50 caliber suppression fire from the B-25s made it nearly suicidal to man exposed gun positions. Sailors who did try to fight back were cut down by streams of bullets. The water-skipping bombs themselves were devastating. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded by maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible. By the time a lookout spotted an incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships. They struck hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses sent explosives tearing through vital compartments. Following the B-25s came 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron, also flying at masthead height. Major Glenn Clark led the first wave of 6 aircraft. As they approached the convoy, Clark could see explosions and fire from the B-25 attacks. He selected a large freighter as his target and began his run. At 200 feet and 240 miles per hour, Clark fired his forward guns and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped perfectly, striking the transport and setting it ablaze. Clark's wing clipped the ship's radio mast as he pulled up and over, but his A-20 remained flyable. He circled and could see his target, later identified as Teiyo Maru, burning fiercely from multiple hits. Other A-20 pilots attacked with equal success. Captain Ed Chudaba bombed the same freighter Clark had hit, ensuring its destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor attacked Kembu Maru, the smallest ship in the convoy. Their bombs struck home, and the vessel began sinking immediately. Above the low-level carnage, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived to protect the convoy. The air battle was fierce but brief. American pilots flying aircraft superior to the Japanese fighters in speed and firepower shot down enemy planes with methodical efficiency. 3 P-38s were lost in the engagement, but their sacrifice ensured that the bombers could continue their attacks without interference. The Japanese fighters that did break through to attack the B-25s and A-20s found the bombers' defensive firepower formidable. Waist gunners and tail gunners on the American aircraft shot back fiercely. Several Japanese fighters went down to bomber defensive fire. The clock showed 10:15 a.m. when the devastating truth became undeniable. Just 15 minutes had passed since the first bombs fell. All 8 transport vessels lay crippled or dying in the churning waters. Most were already listing badly. Smoke billowed from their shattered hulls. Flames licked at their superstructures. 3 destroyers had suffered catastrophic damage. Their steel plates buckled and torn. Their guns silenced forever. The Bismarck Sea transformed into a graveyard of twisted metal and human desperation. Debris floated everywhere. Oil slicks spread like black blood across the blue Pacific. Japanese sailors leaped from burning ships into the unforgiving ocean. Above this apocalyptic scene, American and Australian airmen stared in disbelief. Their eyes widened behind goggles. Their hands gripped control sticks with white knuckles. The technique they had drilled for weeks had worked beyond their wildest dreams. Low-altitude attacks had proven more than effective. They had become instruments of absolute destruction. The convoy had departed Rabaul with such confidence just days before. Officers had stood proudly on bridges. Troops had lined the rails, eager for battle. Now that same convoy was being methodically obliterated, ship by ship, life by life. But Japanese determination ran deeper than defeat. The remaining destroyers refused to surrender. Their crews kept fighting, even as transport ships burned around them. Anti-aircraft guns continued firing. Searchlights swept the sky. Radio operators transmitted final messages. The rising sun still flew from damaged masts. That afternoon brought no mercy. Allied aircraft returned like vultures to carry on. The second wave repeated the morning's pattern of devastation. B-17. Flying fortresses dropped their loads from medium altitude. Bombs whistled down through tropical air. Explosions erupted across the water's surface. Meanwhile, B-25 Mitchell bombers executed their precision runs at wave-top level. Engines screamed at maximum power. Pilots held steady courses through walls of flak. Gunners raked enemy decks with machine gun fire. The sea boiled with explosions and debris. By 3:36 p.m., the slaughter was complete. 8 transport ships rested on the ocean floor. 3 destroyers had joined them in their final dive. The Bismarck Sea had claimed another dozen victims of modern warfare. 1 destroyer managed to survive the daylight hours. Tokitsukaze drifted helplessly through the tropical night. Her engines were silent. Her steering was gone. Her crew waited for dawn or death. Sundown on March 4th brought her final moments. She slipped beneath the waves as darkness fell. Only 4 destroyers escaped the carnage. Shikinami limped away with damaged hull plates. Asagumo trailed smoke from her stack. Yukikaze carried wounded men below decks. Hironami bore scars across her superstructure. Even these survivors carried the marks of defeat. The human cost staggered everyone who calculated it. 6,900 Japanese troops had sailed from Rabaul, bound for Leh. They had carried dreams of victory and thoughts of home. Only 1,200 made it to shore alive. Their weapons were lost. Their equipment lay scattered across the ocean floor. Another 2,700 were plucked from the water by destroyers and submarines. They returned to Rabaul as broken men. Most had lost everything except their lives. Their rifles fed the fish. Their ammunition was gone forever. Approximately 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors never saw another sunrise. They went down with their ships in explosions of fire and steam. They drowned in oil-slicked waters while calling for help that never came. The Bismarck Sea became their tomb. Allied losses seemed almost impossible to believe. 13 American and Australian airmen had died. 10 fell in actual combat with the enemy. 3 perished in a tragic accident far from battle. 8 wounded men would recover in field hospitals. 4 aircraft had been destroyed. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress crashed after taking direct hits. 3 P-38 Lightning fighters went down fighting. 1 B-25 Mitchell bomber and 1 fighter crashed during routine operations. Against 12 Japanese ships sunk and thousands of enemy troops killed, the exchange rate defied all military experience. The controversy began immediately afterward. It would haunt participants for the remainder of their lives. March 4th brought Allied aircraft and PT boats to patrol the waters where the convoy had died. They searched for survivors floating on debris and life rafts. The orders they received were brutal and crystal clear. Strafe the lifeboats until they sank. Machine gun the rafts until nothing moved. Prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore where they could regroup and fight again. No survivors were to be spared. No mercy was to be shown. The rationale was coldly calculated and militarily logical. Every Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea beaches would eventually have to be killed by American or Australian infantry. Better to finish them in the water than face them in brutal jungle combat later. Every enemy eliminated now meant Allied lives saved tomorrow. But carrying out these orders devastated those who pulled the triggers. Pilots reported seeing groups of 200 survivors clinging to makeshift rafts. They received radio commands to attack until no movement remained below. PT boats machine-gunned Japanese swimmers throughout the long night hours. Searchlights illuminated targets. Guns chattered endlessly. American commanders offered justification by pointing to Japanese atrocities and tactical necessity. During the battle itself, Japanese Zero fighters had strafed American airmen who bailed out of a damaged B-17 nicknamed Double Trouble. The enemy had shot parachuting airmen as they drifted helplessly toward the sea. No quarter had been given or expected. Allied soldiers fighting across New Guinea had witnessed Japanese troops conducting bayonet practice on living prisoners. They had seen evidence of cannibalism among enemy forces. They had learned that Japanese soldiers refused to surrender even when facing certain death. The brutal reality of Pacific warfare made mercy seem like dangerous luxury. Yet for aircrew who carried out attacks on survivors, the mission was deeply haunting. Some would struggle with these memories for decades afterward. They understood the military necessity behind their orders. They had heard countless stories of Japanese atrocities against prisoners and civilians, but shooting helpless men in the water violated something fundamental in their understanding of honorable warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. His assessment proved completely accurate over time. The battle demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft could destroy naval convoys without support from surface ships or aircraft carriers. It showed that low-altitude bombing was not desperate gamble, but reliable tactic. Most importantly, it permanently closed sea routes to New Guinea. After witnessing complete destruction of the Leh convoy, Japanese commanders made no further attempts to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons by ship. The isolation of Japanese forces on the island became absolute. Their eventual defeat became mathematically inevitable. For Edward Larner, architect and leader of the devastating attacks, victory represented the pinnacle of his military career. He had taken experimental technique tested only in isolated training exercises. He had perfected it through relentless drilling of his crews. Then he had led his men into combat with results that exceeded every expectation and prediction. His B-25 crews had scored 17 direct hits out of 37 bombs dropped. This accuracy rate approached 50%. High-altitude bombing could never achieve such precision against maneuvering targets. The technique had proven itself under the ultimate test of combat. General Kenny praised Larner enthusiastically and recommended him for immediate promotion and decoration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became legendary throughout the Pacific Theater. Stories of their impossible victory spread through every airfield and barracks. Other units wanted to learn their techniques. Tragically, Larner did not survive to see final victory in the Pacific. April 30, 1943, brought his death in a flying accident. Less than 2 months had passed since his triumph at the Bismarck Sea. He was approaching Dobodura Airfield for a routine landing when fate intervened. Larner performed his trademark maneuver as he had done countless times before. He dove toward the runway in his B-25 Mitchell bomber. Then he pulled up sharply into a spectacular chandelle. The stunt always looked dangerous and drew gasps from observers, but Larner had executed it dozens of times without incident. This time proved fatally different. His aircraft was heavily overloaded with fuel for the return journey. 8 passengers crowded into the cabin. Baggage filled every available space. Tools and spare parts added extra weight. 2,000 pounds of bombs hung beneath the wings. When Larner pulled back on the control column at the bottom of his dive, the overloaded bomber could not respond. The aircraft stalled at low altitude with no room for recovery. It entered a flat spin that no pilot could control. The B-25 crashed nose first and exploded in a fireball that consumed everything. No one survived the impact and fire. Larner left behind a grieving wife and 2 young daughters. He was buried at Port Moresby with full military honors. His legend was already secure through those 15 minutes of combat that changed naval warfare forever. Captain John Hennebrey had flown as one of Larner's wingmen during the Bismarck Sea attack. He took command of the 90th Squadron and led it through the remainder of the war. The squadron continued using techniques that Larner had perfected. They sank dozens more Japanese ships throughout 1943 and 1944. Hennebrey himself rose to Major General rank after the war. He eventually served as president of the Air Force Association. He carried forward the legacy of innovation and aggressive leadership that Larner had exemplified. The tactical innovations lived on through new generations of airmen. The innovations developed for the Bismarck Sea battle spread rapidly throughout the Pacific Theater and beyond. Other squadrons converted their B-25 Mitchell bombers into fearsome gunships. They added nose cannons and forward-firing machine guns. A-20 Havoc and B-26 Marauder units adopted low-altitude attacks as standard procedure for anti-shipping operations. The technique even crossed oceans to the Mediterranean theater. American bombers used skip bombing against German and Italian vessels in European waters. Results were consistently devastating. Enemy ships had no effective defense against attacks they could barely see coming. The British had experimented with similar tactics early in the war. They refined their own versions after learning of spectacular American success in the Pacific. Royal Air Force crews began practicing skip bombing techniques. They adapted the methods to their own aircraft and conditions. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound and lasting. Ship captains, who had once felt relatively safe when protected by destroyer escorts and fighter coverage, now understood their vulnerability. They faced attacks they could not evade or defend against effectively. Fear replaced confidence in convoy operations. The convoy system that had sustained Japanese garrisons across the Pacific became completely untenable in areas where Allied land-based aircraft could operate. Japanese planners were forced to rely increasingly on submarines for supply missions. Fast destroyer runs conducted under cover of darkness became the norm. These methods accepted far lower cargo capacities and much higher operational risks. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated Lieutenant General Kenny's strategic vision completely. His insistence on modifying conventional bombers for unconventional missions had paid enormous dividends. His willingness to embrace unorthodox tactics had changed the course of the war. His ability to identify and promote aggressive leaders like Larner had proven decisive. Kenny's innovative approach became the standard model for air power employment throughout the Pacific. He had demonstrated that creativity and adaptation could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. The 5th Air Force, under his command, came to dominate the skies over the Southwest Pacific. This air superiority made MacArthur's Island hopping campaign possible. The technical lessons proved equally significant for aircraft development. Designers learned that medium bombers could be successfully modified for roles far beyond their original specifications. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed as conventional medium-altitude bomber. After conversion into gunship configuration, it became one of the most versatile aircraft of the entire war. The forward-firing armament concept influenced post-war attack aircraft design significantly. The principle of combining suppressive fire with precision weapons delivery became fundamental to close air support doctrine. Modern ground attack aircraft still follow principles established over the Bismarck Sea. For individual pilots and crew members who participated in the battle, the experience proved completely transformative. They had trained for a mission that seemed nearly impossible to survive. They had faced anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range while flying straight and level. They had delivered bombs with split-second timing while flying at speeds that left absolutely no margin for error. And they had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations or dreams. The confidence gained from that success carried through the rest of their military service and beyond. Men who had doubted the tactics before the battle became its most fervent advocates afterward. Crews that had been skeptical about attacking warships at 200 feet altitude became eager for more similar missions. The 90th Bombardment Squadron developed esprit de corps that made it one of the most effective units in the entire Pacific theater. Other squadrons wanted to emulate their success. Pilots requested transfers to units practicing skip bombing techniques. The innovation spread through enthusiasm and proven results. Statistical analysis of the battle reveals dramatic effectiveness of low-altitude attacks compared to conventional high-altitude tactics. The B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, attacking from 5,000 to 7,000 feet, achieved approximately 3% hit rate. This was consistent with peacetime practice bombing, but completely inadequate against maneuvering targets. The B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc bombers, using low-altitude techniques at 200 feet, achieved hit rates exceeding 50% consistently. Some experienced crews scored hits with every single bomb dropped during their attacks. The difference was attributable to multiple interconnected factors. Reduced distance meant dramatically less time for targets to maneuver between bomb release and impact. Horizontal trajectory required much less precise timing than vertical drops from high altitude. Suppressive fire from nose guns degraded enemy defensive capabilities significantly. The psychological impact of aircraft roaring directly over mastheads disrupted enemy response coordination completely. Development of the skip bombing technique required solving numerous complex technical challenges. Bombs had to be equipped with delayed action fuses that would survive initial impact with water surface without detonating prematurely. The fuse delay had to be precisely calculated. Too long and the weapon might sink before detonating. Too short and the attacking aircraft would be destroyed by its own bomb blast. Pilots learned through extensive practice that releasing bombs from exactly 200 feet altitude at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour produced the most consistent results. Deviations of even 20 feet in altitude or 10 miles per hour in airspeed could cause bombs to sink immediately rather than skip properly. Alternatively, bombs might skip completely over targets without detonating. The precision required was truly extraordinary. It was achieved through hundreds of practice runs and innate skill of experienced pilots who could gauge altitude and airspeed by pure instinct. Flying at 200 feet over water in combat conditions required incredible concentration and nerves of steel. The modified B-25 Mitchell bombers themselves represented remarkable feats of field engineering and improvisation. Major Paul Gunn and his maintenance crews performed modifications that North American Aviation, the original manufacturer, had never imagined or designed for. The structural changes required to mount additional weapons were complex and dangerous. Electrical systems needed to fire multiple machine guns simultaneously had to be completely redesigned. Ammunition storage solutions for thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition had to be improvised with limited tools and resources. That these field modifications worked reliably under extreme combat conditions testified to ingenuity and dedication of ground crews. Many maintenance personnel worked 18-hour days, keeping aircraft flyable under impossible conditions. They scrounged replacement parts from damaged planes that would never fly again. They fabricated mounting brackets and weapon mounts from scrap metal found around airfields. They kept B-25 bombers in the air through pure determination and creative improvisation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also highlighted critical importance of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance in modern warfare. Allied victory was possible only because codebreakers had revealed the convoy's planned route and final destination in advance. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked ships despite terrible weather conditions that limited visibility. Communication systems had successfully coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons operating across vast distances and difficult terrain. The integration of intelligence collection, reconnaissance flights, and strike capabilities demonstrated evolution of warfare into increasingly technological and information-dependent enterprise. The Japanese convoy had failed, not because its commanders were incompetent or cowardly. They had made reasonable decisions based on information available to them. But every aspect of their mission had been compromised by superior Allied intelligence gathering and exploitation capabilities. The enemy had known their plans before they departed port. In the broader strategic context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a definitive turning point in the struggle for New Guinea. Japanese forces on the island were already under severe pressure from Australian and American ground forces advancing through jungle terrain. Now they found themselves completely cut off from reinforcement and resupply by sea. The garrison at Leh, which the destroyed convoy had been specifically intended to reinforce, fell to Allied forces 6 months later in September 1943. The Japanese defensive perimeter contracted inexorably as island after island fell to American amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming air power superiority. The air superiority that made these invasions possible was built directly on foundations laid at the Bismarck Sea. The battle had demonstrated conclusively that Allied forces could dominate not just the skies above contested territories, but also control the seas around them through innovative application of land-based air power. The human dimension of the battle deserves particular remembrance and honor. Beyond statistics of ships sunk and aircraft lost were individual stories of extraordinary courage and ultimate sacrifice. The B-17 Flying Fortress crew, who bailed out of double trouble only to be machine-gunned by Japanese Zero fighters while dangling helplessly in their parachutes over the ocean. The P-38 Lightning pilots who went down fighting desperately to protect bomber formations from enemy interceptors. The Japanese sailors who remained at their posts firing anti-aircraft guns even as their ships disintegrated and burned around them. The Allied aircrew who flew mission after dangerous mission, knowing that single mistake at 200 feet altitude meant absolutely certain death. War demands extraordinary courage from all participants, regardless of nationality or cause. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea witnessed remarkable courage, displayed by both sides under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Men faced death with dignity and determination. They fought for their countries and their comrades with everything they possessed. The controversy over attacks on survivors floating in the water has never been fully resolved by military historians or ethicists. Most military analysts generally accept that the decision was militarily justifiable within the brutal context of total war being fought across the Pacific. Every Japanese soldier eliminated at sea meant lives potentially saved among Allied ground forces who would otherwise have faced those same soldiers in future jungle combat. Given Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized fighting to the death and made surrender almost completely unknown, allowing survivors to reach shore virtually guaranteed more casualties later in the campaign. The pragmatic military argument seemed clear and compelling to commanders making life and death decisions. Yet the ethical dimension remains deeply troubling even decades later. Attacking helpless men floating in the water violated ancient codes of military honor that dated back many centuries. The pragmatic argument that Japanese forces would have done the same thing, and had indeed done much worse, does not fully address the moral complexity involved. Some participants struggled with memories of that day for the remainder of their lives. Others maintained that they had simply done what total war required of them. The debate continues among those who study military ethics and the moral dimensions of warfare. Modern military analysts studying the Battle of the Bismarck Sea have identified several key factors that contributed decisively to Allied success in the engagement. Tactical innovation driven by operational necessity had solved the fundamental problem of hitting maneuvering ships at sea. Realistic training under combat conditions had prepared air crews for actual battle. Combined arms coordination effectively used different aircraft types in complementary roles that maximized their individual strengths. Excellent intelligence had provided crucial targeting information and enabled detailed mission planning. Technological adaptation had successfully modified standard aircraft for highly specialized roles they were never designed to perform. Each factor was individually necessary for success. Together they proved sufficient for complete victory. The battle serves as classic case study in how innovation, intensive training, superior intelligence, and combined operations can overcome significant numerical or technological disadvantages. Edward Larner's legacy extends far beyond his tragically short life and career. His willingness to embrace unconventional tactics and his exceptional skill in training men to execute them saved countless Allied lives throughout the Pacific Campaign. Every Japanese soldier who died in the Bismarck Sea was one fewer enemy that American or Australian infantry would face in the deadly jungles of New Guinea. Every ship sunk represented one less cargo of weapons and ammunition that would have killed Allied soldiers in future battles. The skip bombing technique that Larner perfected became standard operating procedure for anti-shipping operations throughout the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese vessels fell to low-altitude attacks over the following 2 years of fighting. The maritime supply lines that Japan desperately needed to sustain its far-flung Pacific Empire were systematically severed by aircraft flying at altitudes that conventional military wisdom had deemed completely suicidal. Innovation had trumped conventional thinking through courage and determination. In reunions held decades later, veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle spoke of the mission with mixture of intense pride and lingering wonder. Pride in their unprecedented accomplishment under impossible conditions. Wonder that they had actually survived flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire while delivering bombs with split-second precision timing. The 15 minutes of combat at masthead altitude had been the most intensely terrifying experience of their entire lives. Many compared it to flying through hell itself, while somehow emerging alive on the other side. Yet, they had not merely survived. They had achieved total victory against overwhelming odds. Their innovative tactics had been completely validated through combat results. Their personal courage had been tested and proven under fire. Their place in military history had been permanently secured through their actions that day over the Bismarck Sea. The fundamental principles validated at the Bismarck Sea remain relevant to contemporary military operations around the world. Innovation can successfully overcome conventional limitations when properly applied. Realistic training under combat conditions prepares forces for actual battle far better than theoretical exercises. Integration of different military capabilities achieves combined effects far greater than the sum of their individual parts. Adaptation of existing systems can meet new operational requirements much faster than waiting for perfect solutions to be developed. Intelligence exploitation provides decisive advantages when properly gathered and utilized. These lessons learned in the skies over the Bismarck Sea 80 years ago continue to inform military planning and execution today. The names of those who fought may be fading from public memory, but the principles they validated through blood and courage remain relevant to every generation that must defend freedom against tyranny. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands permanently as one of the most decisive engagements in the entire Pacific War. A Japanese convoy that should have reached its destination safely according to all conventional military wisdom was instead completely destroyed by innovative tactics executed with extraordinary skill and determination. The skip bombing technique that accomplished this stunning victory had been considered nearly suicidal by conventional military thinkers. Edward Larner and his courageous men had proven that conventional wisdom was dangerously inadequate. They flew at altitudes that invited destruction from enemy fire. They dropped bombs with timing precision that allowed absolutely no margin for error. They achieved results that exceeded every expectation and prediction. 12 Japanese ships sank forever into the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of enemy soldiers died in those waters. The sea route to New Guinea was permanently closed to enemy reinforcement. The course of the entire war shifted irrevocably toward Allied victory, all accomplished in 15 minutes of combat that demonstrated the incredible power of courage, innovation, and absolute determination. The forbidden tactic became standard operating procedure. The supposedly suicidal method became routine for anti-shipping operations. The allegedly impossible mission became template for countless successful attacks throughout the Pacific Campaign. Edward Larner did not survive to witness final victory over Japan, but his contribution to that ultimate victory was absolutely immeasurable. The pilots who followed him into combat at 200 feet altitude carried his tactical legacy forward through the war. The skip bombing techniques he perfected sank hundreds of Japanese ships over the following 2 years of bitter fighting. The exceptional courage he exemplified inspired thousands of aircrew members who faced similar dangers in subsequent missions. His name deserves to be permanently remembered alongside the greatest innovators of military history, the visionary leaders who fundamentally changed warfare through brilliant insight and exceptional daring. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was Edward Larner's masterpiece of tactical innovation. Its lessons continue echoing through decades to inspire new generations who must face new challenges with the same powerful combination of innovation, intensive training, personal courage, and unwavering determination that characterized those historic 15 minutes over the Pacific in March 1943 when everything changed forever.